Well, hello there, sweet friend. It's Carol Jean, and I've been sitting here on my little porch swing, rocking back and forth with the scent of honeysuckle drifting in on this warm afternoon, and something's been tugging at my heart so fiercely I can barely catch my breath. It was just an ordinary June day, the cicadas humming like distant church hymns, when a memory knocked like a soft tap on the door of my mind, Mama's voice calling me in for supper, though supper was never just supper in that house. It was a summons, a reminder that I belonged to her, bound by duty and guilt in equal parts. At this moment, dear, if you feel your heart stirring, maybe give me a little thumbs up or drop a line in the comments. Carol Jean would be mighty grateful for the company. I remember the exact moment it came flooding back, late afternoon slanting sunlight, the lace curtains dancing in the breeze, and me kneeling before her shiny poodle, Lulu, brushing each curl like it was the greatest treasure I'd ever laid eyes on. That instant, it hit me like a sudden storm, because Lulu received more of Mama's smiles and kind words than I ever did, and there I was, forgotten in the dust of her approval. I suppose it all began to weigh on me as I settled into the creaky rocker, the memories unfolding like the fraying threads of my old quilt, how Mama would pat Lulu's head tenderly and call him her darling little prince, while I, her flesh and blood, sat out in the hallway, forbidden to answer the doorbell or tend to neighbors who came calling with casseroles she insisted she didn't need. She said I was too delicate, too fragile for the world outside. Yet she wore that air of selfless piety in public, Miss Linda, the benevolent church lady, offering warm cookies and a pat on the hand, while behind those doors she wielded her sharp tongue like a scalpel, reminding me with every cutting remark that I was her one great mistake, a sorry child no one else would have put up with. But why? Why does this memory still nestle in my chest, fluttering its wings like a caged bird longing to be free? Perhaps it's because I lived under that roof for 60 long years, stitching together other people's dreams with my old sewing machine, never daring to take a single stitch for my own self. And now here I sit, widow at 68, heart a little weaker but spirit. Well, I like to think that spirit's as stubborn as a mule, refusing to be broken. The memory stirs questions. How do we carry the weight of someone's love when it comes laced with thorns? How do we forgive ourselves for surviving? So right now, as the sun dips lower and the porch light flickers on, I'm asking you to stay with me, friend, because this story doesn't end with that long ago supper call, and I promise you, it's a journey worth seeing through to the last breath. There's more to tell about Mama's final gift to Lulu, about the will that left her house and bank account to a pampered poodle, and about how that little twist of fate set me stumbling toward my own new beginning. Thank you for sitting with me under these oak trees, for letting me whisper my truths into the evening air. If you've ever felt the sting of cold words from someone you loved, or carried a secret you weren't sure you'd ever share, I hope you'll lean in a little closer and come back for the rest of my tale, because I believe that in the telling, we find the courage to walk out of those invisible cages, one careful step at a time. I was only 10 years old when I first learned that kindness could cut both ways. Back then, our little town of Clinton, just a hop and a skip from Jackson, was all dusty roads and cotton fields swaying under that big Mississippi sky. Mornings smelled of fresh-baked biscuits cooling on windowsills, and the church bell tolled down at First Baptist, calling everyone in for Sunday school. My world was a small wooden house at the edge of Pine Grove, with lilac bushes out front and a swing hanging from the old oak tree, just me, Mama, and the quiet hum of cicadas in the heat. I used to think life was simple. You helped your neighbors, you shared your sweet tea on a hot afternoon, and you believed that people always came back around to you in the end. Mama, well, she was the picture of Southern grace when company came calling. She'd put on her best pearls, straighten her crisp white gloves, and serve cornbread with a smile that could light up the parlor. Carol Jeannie, she'd say, smoothing my hair before the ladies arrived. Remember, sugar, we open our home and our hearts. And I believed her, I truly did. I believed that goodness lived in everybody's chest, like a gentle melody you couldn't help but hum. At school, I'd offer my pencil to a classmate, share my tangerine at recess, and dream that one day I'd grow up to be just as beloved as Mama was in town. But behind those lace curtains, behind that gracious welcome, there was a different tune playing. I'd sneak into the hallway just to feel her eyes on me, watching every move I made, how I tied my ribbons, how I stacked my dolls, even how I marched in the church choir. "Don't you dare make a sound when you walk, child," she'd whisper through clenched teeth. "We have a reputation to keep." And I'd linger in that hush, trying to shrink myself small enough to disappear. I dreamed of being light as air so she wouldn't see me at all. Still, in those early years, I held tightly to my hopes. I'd press my forehead against the window pane and imagine a future where I could write down my own stories, patch quilts of bright calicos, or stitch dresses for all the little girls in Pine Grove, so they'd feel as pretty as I sometimes wished I did. I believed that people, like rivers, would eventually circle back, carrying forgiveness in their wake. Kindness, I used to tell my best friend Ruth End, is the bravest thing a person can be. And she'd laugh and say, "Oh, Carol, you and your big heart." Our days had a gentle rhythm. Sunrise prayers whispered in the bedroom, midday chores under the magnolia trees, and evenings spent on the porch swing with Mama humming old hymns to herself. The cicadas would join in, filling the air with that lazy chorus, and I'd lean on her shoulder, dreaming of weddings and children and a life where love never cut deep. I carried my dreams tucked inside me like precious daisies in a jar, clinging to the hope that a kind word would someday comfort me the way I comforted others. But every so often, just as the sun dipped low and the golden light stretched across the porch floorboards, Mama would turn to me in that same warm voice she used with her church friends and say something that froze my heart. "Sweet pea, you'll never amount to much, you're too soft. People will step all over you." And in that moment, I understood that kindness, without boundaries, could feel like a cage. I learned to cradle my dreams quietly, hidden beneath layers of obedience and silent nods, praying for a day when my own voice might be heard and honored for the gentle woman I longed to become. It was a late summer evening when the unexpected waltzed into my life like a stray breeze through an open window, carrying the scent of wild honeysuckle and the sound of laughter not meant for my ears. I was 21 then, standing at the edge of our county fairgrounds, fingering the frayed hem of my apron as I watched the carousel lights dance in the gathering dusk. Mama had reluctantly allowed me to work the bake sale booth, though she insisted I spend my time perfecting my biscuits, not chasing after strangers' compliments, and I'd spent the day handing out chocolate-dipped shortbread to neighbors whose faces I recognized, never imagining that a single moment would shift the whole course of my story. That moment arrived in the form of a dark-eyed stranger with a crooked smile and a gentle voice, who leaned over the booth to ask for just one more pecan praline, if you please. His name was Thomas Beckett, a young schoolteacher from the next town over, with calloused hands that spoke of Sunday afternoons spent coaching youth baseball and evenings grading essays by lamplight. When he spoke, my heart did that peculiar little flutter one I'd only ever felt when Mama called my name, and I stood frozen in anticipation of her next word. "You've got magic in these sweets, Miss Carol," he said, his eyes warm but curious, as if he were discovering something hidden behind the civilities of a stranger's smile. I remember the surprise that bloomed in my chest, curiosity wrapped in a ribbon of hope, and how I couldn't stop myself from watching him walk away, nibbling on the praline as though it were the sweetest secret he'd ever tasted. For the first time, I wondered if the world beyond Pine Grove might hold something more than chores and quiet obedience, if maybe kindness could be returned with more than a pointed critique or a stern "remember your place." That same week, Thomas invited me to the church's weekly hymn practice. He said I had a voice that deserved more than the dusty corners of the Sunday choir. I hesitated, picturing Mama's disapproving frown, but something inside me whispered that I owed myself this small act of bravery. So on Thursday evening, I slipped into my best calico dress and found him waiting by the entrance, a soft leather satchel slung across his shoulder, filled with hymn sheets and chalk-stained notebooks. As we walked through the rose garden that bordered the church lawn, he told me stories of his students, how one shy boy had finally read aloud in class, how another had discovered a love for arithmetic in the curve of a graph, and I listened, spellbound by his gentle enthusiasm, wondering why I'd never heard such tenderness directed at me. By the time we reached the old wooden doors, my pulse was racing. I remember thinking, I cannot believe how alive my heart feels, when just days before it was tamed by Mama's disapproval and the weight of unspoken demands. Inside, the room smelled of polished pews and church hymnals, and as I lifted my voice in that first trembling verse, Thomas's eyes met mine from the back row, shining with encouragement. In that moment, I felt a spark of possibility, that perhaps I could be more than the quiet daughter hidden behind lace curtains, that kindness might flow back to me in the form of genuine care and respect. Of course, this new chapter didn't erase the old patterns overnight. Mama's sharp criticisms found me the very next morning, singing with that stranger will do you no good, but something in me had shifted. I carried Thomas's laughter like a pocketful of sunshine, and I began to believe that my own voice mattered beyond the walls of our little house. That summer evening became the seed of a new story, one where I could choose moments of joy even when the shadows of the past tried to claim me. It was the first real turning point in my life, the first time I tasted the sweetness of being seen, and it set me on a path toward understanding that sometimes the most unexpected people bring us face to face with our truest selves and give us the courage to step into the light. That autumn brought a cold I didn't expect, not the nip of the Mississippi breeze, but the chill that settled deep in my bones when Mama found out I'd been sneaking off to practice with Thomas. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the pines and the church bell chimed 6 o'clock, I tiptoed back through the old screen door, heart fluttering like a captive bird. I still smelled of magnolia and candle wax. I still carried the echo of Thomas's gentle laughter in my ears. But Mama was waiting in the parlor, arms crossed, eyes colder than any winter wind I'd ever felt. "Where have you been, Carol Jeannie?" she asked, voice low and controlled, as though she were reciting a particularly delicate prayer. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her how alive I felt under those vaulted ceilings, how it pained me to sit in silence when music filled my chest with warmth. But the words caught in my mouth, tangled in fear and the memory of her cutting voice. Instead, I mumbled something about running an errand for Mrs. Henderson down the road, hoping she'd believe I'd been at home. She didn't. Mama's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought I might shatter right there on the threadbare rug. Then she said, "You are too soft, too prone to foolish notions of romance and foolish notions of calling strangers friends." She paused, her eyes distant and sharp. "You will stay here, where you belong, and mind your manners." And just like that, the sanctuary I'd felt at church dissolved into the cold stone of her disapproval. In the days that followed, Mama made sure every step I took reminded me of my place. She forbade me from leaving the house after breakfast, assigning me to polish silver spoons and starch the church tablecloths for the next Sunday potluck. Each chore was a sentence, each sentence a reminder that I was nothing without her guidance. Outside, the world continued in its golden haze, children laughing in haylofts, freshly painted signs advertising the county fair. But I watched it all through a window smeared with laundry starch and regret. I felt trapped between my dreams of melody and the heavy chain of Mama's well. At night, I lay awake on my narrow bed, listening to the pitter-patter of rain on the tin roof and to my own heart, pounding like a warning drum. I hated how small I'd become, how my own voice sounded strange and timid when I tried to imagine singing again. Tears came unbidden, not just from sorrow but from the anger I dared not speak aloud. Anger at Mama for clipping my wings, anger at myself for believing her compliments in public so wholeheartedly, anger at that sweet poodle, Lulu, who lounged in comfort while I hovered between obedience and desire. Only my friend Ruth and offered quiet support, slipping me a note passed under the fence one afternoon, reading, "Don't let her dim your light. You're meant for more than shadows." Her words felt like a lifeline, but even her courage couldn't banish the fear that had settled in my chest. I wondered, was I betraying my duty by chasing my own dreams? Was I ungrateful for every meal and every stitch and every lesson Mama claimed to give me? The guilt pressed against me like a second skin. I felt pulled in two directions, toward the future I longed for, and toward the safety of the only home I'd ever known, even if it was built on fear and hushed reproach. That season of struggle tested me in ways I'd never imagined. I learned that the sweetest hope can taste bitter when it runs headlong into someone else's well. I discovered that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought in silence, in the hollow between a daughter's heartbeat and a mother's command. And though I carried on with my days, pressing starched linens, tending the tea kettle, nodding in solemn agreement whenever Mama spoke, I felt something shift deep within me. A quiet resolve burned behind my ribs. If my voice was ever to matter, I would have to find a way to sing again, not just in secret hymns, but in the story of my own life. I remember that morning as if the world itself had caught its breath. Time slowed to a hush, and every tick of the old grandfather clock in Mama's parlor echoed like a drum in my chest. I'd been sitting by her bedside for days, spooning thin chicken broth between her cracked lips, folding the hem of her nightgown so it lay smooth against her frail skin. The house was too quiet. Lulu's gentle whine had faded, and even the wind in the magnolias outside seemed to tiptoe. Then, just as the late afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains, Mama's hand trembled in mine, and I heard the faintest rasp of a breath that wasn't quite a breath. I leaned closer, my heart hammering, and in that frozen moment, the one where the clock's pendulum drew a silent arc, I understood that everything was about to change. She opened her eyes, calm and distant, as if she were peering through me rather than at me. "Carol Jeannie," she whispered, voice thinner than spider silk, "you've stayed by my side these long years, even when I made it hard." I pressed my forehead against hers, tasting the faint, metallic tang of her medicine on her breath. Tears pooled in my eyes, but I bit back my sob, afraid to break the fragile spell of stillness. "Mama," I whispered, but she shook her head, the light in her eyes dimming like the dying embers of a hearth fire. "Promise me," she said, her voice hollow and urgent, "promise me you'll be free." I'd never heard her ask for anything but obedience. My throat constricted. "Yes, Mama," I managed, though the word felt lodged in my throat like gravel. Then her hand went limp in mine, and the breath I'd been waiting for slipped away, leaving the room colder than bone. In that instant, I felt the walls close in, the years of sharp words and silent meals pressing down on me like a weight I'd carried too long. The sting of relief mingled with sorrow, and I realized I was crying against my own will, tears for the daughter I'd been, bound by duty, and tears for the woman I was about to become, unmoored at last. I sat there, cradling her still hand, as the clock's pendulum finally began to swing again, its steady rhythm a reminder that life had not stopped despite my broken heart. In the days that followed, the house felt haunted by her absence. I wandered through the empty rooms as if searching for echoes of her clipped laughter or the rustle of her skirts. The poodle, Lulu, lay by the hearth, eyes clouded with confusion. I pitied him, trapped in legacy the way I'd been trapped in Mama's will. And then came the lawyer's letter, cold and legal, announcing that everything, every last dollar, every bond, Every dusty piece of furniture had been left to that pampered creature. I remember crumpling the paper in my fist, feeling the paper cut into my palm, and realizing that the final insult was not in her death, but in her parting gift, a trust for a dog and a ragged sewing machine for me. The only thing you ever had that you wanted, she'd scribbled in her shaky hand. I sat at that sewing machine, its paint chipped and its bobbin empty, and thought of the years I'd spent stitching dresses for others, never once creating for myself. The room blurred with tears, and in that flood of grief and bitter relief, I felt something crack open inside me, a fragile promise of life beyond Mama's reign. I understood then that her death and her final act of favoritism toward Lulu had broken the invisible chain she'd wrapped around my shoulders. I was free, yet my heart ached with the weight of all I'd lost, a mother's love that had never been mine, a childhood stolen by cold words, and a lifetime of unspoken dreams. But in the fractured silence of that parlor, I also caught the faintest whisper of hope, a notion that maybe, just maybe, I could finally mend the ragged seams of my own story. And in that moment, seconds after the world tilted back into motion, I realized the depth of my own survival and felt the powerful, terrifying thrill of walking out into the light at last. I spent the weeks after Mama's passing in a kind of heavy quiet, as if the very walls of that old house were holding their breath, waiting to exhale. The mornings began without the sharp click of her heels in the hallway, without the soft whimper of Lulu begging for breakfast, and I'd wake to an unfamiliar hush that pressed against my ears. I'd shuffle into the parlor, where Mama's favorite rocking chair sat empty, its cushions still warm from her final hours, and the afternoon sunlight would sift through the lace curtains, painting the floorboards with ghostly patterns. I felt adrift, like a mariner who's lost sight of shore, no chart to guide me, no compass to steady my hand. At first, I tried to fill the silence the way Mama would have. I polished the silver, starching every linen until they smelled of lavender and ceremony. I scrubbed the hearth until the bricks gleamed. But each scrub and each polish only deepened the echo in my chest, reminding me that these tasks were once her domain, not mine. In the evenings, I'd perch at that old sewing machine, turning the wheel with care, but the bobbin remained stubbornly empty. Every thread I fed through the needle caught on the memory of dresses I'd stitched for others, never daring to fashion a single stitch for my own soul. Without Mama's ever watchful eye, the world outside seemed to lean in closer, but I felt somehow further away. Neighbors whispered their condolences, pressing casseroles into my unsteady hands. The pastor offered prayers and gentle smiles. Even Ruth and dropped by with fresh-baked bread and a soft word or two. I appreciated their kindness, but every gesture felt like a reminder of the cage I'd just stepped out of. I realized that for 60 years I'd defined my worth by how well I served someone else, and now that service had ended, leaving me unmoored, uncertain who I was without the role of dutiful daughter. My faith, once as steady as that old clock, wavered in the aftermath. I found myself standing in the empty pews of First Baptist, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if a God who hears every prayer would forgive me for feeling relief at Mama's passing. I remembered her barbed remarks, "You are too soft," she'd said, and I questioned whether kindness was a gift or a burden. I wondered if the sermons about mercy and grace applied to daughters scarred by love's sharp edges. In the sanctuary, my voice felt small and hollow when I sang. The hymns that once comforted me sounded like distant echoes. Loneliness settled around me like a draft under a door. At night, I'd lie awake, listening to the wind rustling the magnolia outside, half expecting Mama's silhouette to appear in the doorway, ready with a scolding or a demand. But the doorway remained empty, and the world moved forward. Neighbors tending their gardens, children's laughter drifting from the schoolyard, trains rumbling through town, while I lingered in that in-between place, neither child nor fully grown woman, suspended between past obligations and an uncertain future. Yet in that space of emptiness, I began to find small flickers of something I hadn't known in years: quiet self-awareness. I noticed the way my hands softened as I reached for a teacup, how my breath didn't catch when I walked past Lulu's sleeping spot by the hearth. I discovered that the ache in my chest could loosen, ever so slightly, if I allowed myself a moment of stillness, without fear of reproach. I began to speak aloud the dreams I'd stifled long ago, to Ruth N., to the pastor's wife, about traveling beyond Pine Grove, about opening a little shop where I'd sell my own quilts and handmade dresses, each stitch a testament to the life I'd earned for myself. I don't know when the turning point came. Perhaps it was the day I actually threaded the sewing machine and let the needle dance across a scrap of my favorite calico, or the afternoon I found myself humming a hymn in the kitchen, not out of duty but because it made my soul feel lighter. What I do know is that in the silence and the loss, I discovered a fragile kind of freedom, not the triumphant shattering of chains, but the gentle untying of knots, one slow loop at a time. And though the emptiness remains, like a room without its hearth fire, I've learned that some silences are not prisons, but spaces for new stories to find their voice. There came a day not long after I'd settled into that gentle emptiness, when a small spark of purpose caught me entirely off guard. I was walking through town, my hands tucked into the pockets of my faded cardigan, when I spotted Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, struggling with a heavy bag of groceries outside the little market on Main Street. It was the same Mrs. Henderson who'd slipped me notes of encouragement all those years ago, the one who'd taught me how to braid sweetgrass and coax wildflowers into little knots of beauty. My heart fluttered at the sight of her teetering under those sacks, and before I could second-guess myself, I hurried over and offered a steady arm. She thanked me with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes and said, "Carol Jean, you've got the strongest heart of anyone I know." I felt my cheeks warm because I hadn't felt strong in a long while, but her words planted a seed that began to unfurl in my chest. That afternoon, back on my front porch with a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside me, I let myself truly feel the weight of what I'd done, offered help to someone I loved, simply because they needed it. The world beyond my grief didn't feel so distant in that moment. I realized that extending kindness, long my first instinct, could be a path forward, not a trap back into old patterns. I remembered Ruth Ann's note about carrying my light, and for the first time since Mama's passing, I felt the stirrings of my own inner flame glowing steady and true. In the days that followed, I began to look for other ways to be useful on my own terms. I signed up at the local community center to teach a weekly sewing circle, nothing fancy, just a gathering of folks who wanted to learn how to mend a hem or patch a blanket. The first meeting was more nerve-wracking than any hymn solo I'd ever sung. My hands shook as I threaded the needle, and I caught myself hesitating, worried that I might disappoint these good people. But then one by one they arrived. Young mothers with toddlers tugging at their skirts, retirees looking for a hobby, even a high school boy who said he wanted to learn to tailor his own trousers. As they settled around the table, I took a deep breath, felt the smooth wooden tabletop beneath my palms, and remembered that old promise I'd made to myself, to stitch something for my own soul. We spent that morning sharing stories as much as stitches, tales of first dresses sewn for prom, quilts made for newborn grandbabies, and a few whispered confessions about mending torn jeans after a clumsy tumble. When someone struggled with the tension of the thread, I leaned over and gently guided their fingers, just as I once guided my mother's needle when she taught me to sew. But this time, I was teaching not out of duty, but because it warmed me to see their faces light up at the first perfect stitch. By lunchtime, the hum of conversation felt like a choir of friendly voices lifting me higher than any Sunday hymn ever could. That evening, I tucked a small bundle of patches and a length of floral calico into a basket and walked over to the animal shelter on Elm Street. They were always short-staffed, and I'd noticed how some of the volunteers wore old aprons to protect their clothes. I offered up my sewing machine to mend torn bedding and craft little blankets for the kittens and pups waiting for homes. The shelter director's eyes glistened with gratitude, and I realized that in caring for those forgotten creatures, I was caring for a part of myself that still ached to be seen as useful and kind. Slowly, day by day, these little acts of service wove together into something I recognized as hope. I began to believe that my life could hold more than the echoes of Mama's house, that I could shape a new routine, one stitched with compassion and small joys rather than clipped words and silent obedience. My faith in people, in goodness, felt carefully rekindled, a lamp lit at dusk, casting a soft glow but strong enough to guide my next steps. And so, with a cautious heart, I stepped into the second chance, one measured stitch at a time, knowing that the fabric of my days would be richer for having dared to begin anew. I held that rugged sewing machine in my lap for the last time one cool morning, the sun just stretching its fingers across the floorboards, and I felt something inside me shift so quietly I almost missed it. For 68 years, I'd lived under the weight of someone else's voice, first my mother's sharp critiques, then my own timid echoes, and today, I made a decision. I would no longer carry her words in my heart as though they were gospel. I placed the sewing machine on the porch rail where the breeze could kiss its chipped paint, and I watched its metal feet catch the light. In that moment, I realized that the past had shaped me, yes, but it did not have the power to destroy the woman I'd become. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs as if waking me from a long, uneasy sleep. With trembling fingers, I unpinned the stack of Mama's old letters, the ones filled with her cold reminders of duty and failure, and let them slip from my hands into the rusty barrel of my old oil lamp. The letters curled and turned golden at the edges, and then with a small spark and a sigh, they became ash floating up like ghosts set free. I watched until the last curl of smoke vanished into the sky, carrying with it the final shards of a life I'd outgrown. That symbolic act settled something in my soul that words never could. I felt lighter, as though I'd exhaled a lifetime of doubt in a single breath. I turned away from the dwindling pile of ash and faced the wide horizon beyond my backyard, fields of wildflowers swaying in the breeze, the distant hum of cicadas, and the long, low sun painting the world in soft gold. I thought of Lulu, that pampered poodle whose legacy left me everything but freedom, and I realized I didn't resent him anymore. He was, after all, a creature trapped by someone else's love, just as I had been. I closed the porch door behind me without looking back, and felt a thrill at the unfamiliar sound of its latch clicking shut. It was the latch on my past, snapped closed, but not locked. I could return if I wanted, but I knew I wouldn't. I walked to the mailbox and retrieved the key to the little rolling home I'd bought with the money from selling the house, my first real investment in myself. I slid the key into the lock of that tiny door and felt my heart flutter like the wings of a sparrow. Inside, I placed my sewing machine on a small wooden table, threaded it with bright floral thread, and set to work stitching a patchwork quilt made of all the fabric scraps I'd saved for others. Each patch told a story: the gingham from my childhood dress, the lace from the curtains Mama once starched so stiff, the velvet from the scarf I'd worn on my wedding day. As the needle danced through those pieces, I poured into each stitch a prayer of forgiveness, not for Mama, but for myself, that I might move forward unburdened. I sewed until the light outside faded into twilight, and as I ran my hand across the finished quilt, I felt a warmth I'd never known in that old house, a quiet knowing that I was worthy of kindness, even from myself. That night, as I lay under the quilt I'd made with my own hands, I whispered into the stillness, I choose to live on. Without claims, without regrets, just on. And I mended. For the first time, my dreams felt like mine alone, unshackled from old fears and bruised expectations. I closed my eyes with a gentle smile, feeling the weight of the past settle beneath me like a soft pillow, cradling rather than crushing. I drifted to sleep knowing that tomorrow, I would rise as the woman I'd always been meant to be, free to stitch a life of my own design, one careful, hopeful stitch at a time. I've lived a lifetime believing that patience was its own reward, that if I waited long enough, kindness would find me at the end of the road. But what I've learned is that sometimes the gift we're waiting for must be carried in our own hands. I spent decades tending to my mother's needs, believing that my worth was measured by her comfort, only to discover in the silence after her passing that my own soul had grown parched for self-care and self-recognition. Now, when I look back at that younger Carol Jean, the girl who believed that love meant silent obedience, I see someone both brave and broken, someone who stitched dresses for every neighbor's daughter but never allowed herself a single seam of joy. Today, I understand that love is not a ledger where you tally every sacrifice. It is a garden that needs tending with tenderness for yourself as much as for others. I once thought that forgiveness meant restoring harmony at any cost, that turning the other cheek was the noblest act of all. Yet I've come to know that forgiveness can also mean setting down the stones of old hurt so you can finally walk forward with a lighter step. When I watched my mother's letters turn to ash in that oil lamp, I felt no malice, only a profound relief, as though I had released a flock of captive birds into the sky. That release taught me that boundaries are not walls to keep people out, but fences that protect a fragile garden of self-worth. I've learned that saying no can be an act of love, both to the one who needs your strength and to the child inside you who needs to be shielded from harm. In teaching others to sew quilts for newborns, patched blankets for shelter animals, I discovered that our hands hold stories in every stitch. Each thread we weave is a lifeline connecting our past pains to our present purpose. I realized that my own life's fabric, once tattered by years of self-neglect, could be rewoven into something both beautiful and strong. And so I offer this truth to you, dear listener. Your life's value is not determined by how much you give away, but by the care you take in choosing what you keep close to your heart. Perhaps the greatest gift I can share is the permission to stop waiting for the world to hand you approval. Maybe it's time to stop believing that someone else's grace is the only path to peace. You have the power to sow seeds of kindness in your own garden, to speak your truth in gentle firmness, to carve out moments of quiet grace for yourself, and to recognize that the most courageous act is often simply to keep living with an open heart. I don't offer you a formula or a quick fix. Life's hardships seldom bend to tidy moral lessons, but I do offer you a promise. When you allow yourself the freedom to choose, even in the smallest ways, you begin to rewrite your story. You realize that the chapters yet to come can be filled not with echoes of old hurts, but with the vibrant colors of your own making. And if you've ever felt stuck in a waiting room of broken dreams, I invite you now to stand, brush off the fabric of your past, and step into the day you've been longing to live. After all, some of us learn that not every prison has bars, and some of us learn, at last, to walk right out anyway. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and feel the warmth of this quiet twilight settling around us, as if the very air remembers every whispered prayer and every unspoken tear. Maybe you've been carrying your own weight of memories, your own invisible chains, the way I once did under my mother's sharp gaze. But here's what I've come to understand. Our stories aren't just relics of the past. They're living echoes that shape who we are today and who we choose to become tomorrow. As I sit on this porch, the sky painted in pinks and blues, I feel both the ache of all I've lost and the gentle hum of hope that still sings in my veins. I want you to carry that with you, the knowledge that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, but rather weaving your memories into the tapestry of your life, stitch by tender stitch. I wonder, dear friend, what you're holding on to right now. Perhaps it's a love that left you wondering, or a kindness you never quite received. I ask you this. Do you believe that true love should come back to us in one form or another? Is there someone or something you long to see restored in your life? Because for me, sometimes I think Lulu, that pampered little poodle, still pauses by my sewing table, head tilted, as if he remembers the days when he had everything I longed for. And maybe he does remember that soft voice, the gentle strokes, the love that was never quite mine. But I choose to believe he carries no bitterness. He carries only the echoes of affection, and in that reflection I find my own peace. This isn't just my story, it's a mirror for each of us. We all have seasons of cold silence and days of cautious dawn. We all have moments when the world seems too heavy, when the weight of expectations threatens to dim our light. Yet, even in the deepest shadows, there lies a flicker of possibility. You might find it in an unexpected conversation with a friend, the kindness of a stranger, or the simple act of taking up a hobby that feeds your soul. Perhaps it's allowing yourself to say no when your heart trembles, or yes when a new chance knocks. Whatever it is, I urge you to recognize that impulse as your second wind, that new impulse that calls you into life again. Before I leave you tonight, I want you to feel this gentle invitation to listen to your own quiet voice, even if it's soft at first. To honor the lessons woven into your scars, for they are the signposts guiding you forward. And to remember that sometimes the most profound freedom comes not from breaking chains, but from learning to walk in the light beyond them. So, as the crickets begin their evening hymn and the porch light casts its gentle glow, I leave you with this. What do you think? Does true love find its way back into our lives, or does it live on in the choices we make every day? I hope you'll share your thoughts, for every story gains new meaning when we listen to one another. And as you go on with your own journey, know that sometimes, just sometimes, I think he does remember, whether it's a poodle longing for warmth or a heart longing for home. Perhaps that quiet remembering is the true gift we carry, a gentle reminder that love, in all its forms, never truly leaves us.